Leningrad, the jewel of northern Russia, the former St. Petersburg, built by the Tsars as a window to Europe and transformed by the Bolsheviks into a symbol of the new Soviet power. In 1941, the city breathed pride and history. Grand avenues, imperial palaces, factories bustling with activity, and more than 3 million men, women and children who believed they lived in an indestructible bastion of the socialist homeland. But behind this pride, a shadow was growing. Across the border, Hitler had already vowed aloud, Leningrad must be wiped off the map for him. The city should not be conquered. It should be wiped from the face of the earth. Neither surrender nor occupation, only destruction. It was the Führer's direct order: transform Leningrad into a cemetery of concrete and bones. The Nazi plan wasn't just military. It was a death sentence for millions of civilians. Hitler saw Leningrad as the symbolic heart of communism. If that city fell, he believed the entire Soviet Union would tremble. The obedient German generals were already mapping out on paper how to close the siege, cut the railway lines, bomb the factories, and let the people die slowly, without a single mercy shot. Meanwhile, life in Leningrad continued seemingly normally. Workers filled the factories with tanks and ammunition, children went to school, and families walked along the banks of the Neva River. Many were unaware that they were about to become prisoners in their own homes. What awaited this proud city was no ordinary battle. It was the beginning of one of the greatest horrors humanity has ever witnessed. Because in 1941, when the summer sun shone on its golden domes and imposing palaces, Leningrad was still a living city, but it was already on the brink of the abyss, without imagining that in a short time it would be surrounded, bombed and condemned to almost 1,000 days of hunger, cold and death. Don't let history fade. Subscribe and journey through the past where courage and sacrifice shaped the world. In the summer of 1941, Operation Barbarossa swept through the Soviet Union like wildfire. 3 million German soldiers poured across borders, crushing armies, burning villages, and leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Army Group North's objective was clear: advance rapidly and strangle Leningrad. But the city's fate was not a simple occupation. There would be no negotiations, no white flag, no prisoners spared. Hitler had made it clear in his secret. Orders: Leningrad must disappear from the face of the earth. Not a stone must be left standing, not a mouth to feed. To achieve this, the generals devised a cruel plan: to completely surround the city, cutting off every road, every railway line, every supply channel. Luftwaffe planes would bomb food stores, factories and hospitals. Long-range cannons would fire day and night, relentlessly. The goal was not to conquer the city by brute force, but to kill it slowly, suffocating it until millions died of starvation. And there was a second macabre piece to this puzzle. To the north, the Finnish army, allied with Germany, was ordered to advance and close the trap from the other side. Thus, Leningrad would be completely cut off from sea, land and air. An entire city condemned to death like a cornered animal. While German officers sipped champagne from arrow-covered maps, the citizens of Leningrad still walked the busy streets, oblivious to their fate. For Hitler, the Siege of Leningrad would be not only a military victory, but also a spectacle of terror, a warning to the world: whoever defied the Reich would pay with the blood of innocents. The stage was set. The Iron Ring was beginning to close. Leningrad was about to plunge into a hell from which there would be almost no escape. Discover stories almost forgotten by time. Click subscribe and never miss a chapter of real history. September 1941. German armored columns roar along the dusty roads leading north. Finnish troops advance on the other side, through the cold forests, obeying their silent pact with Hitler. Leningrad, the proud city, feels the ground tremble. The ring begins to close. On September 8th, the Germans captured Schlüsselburg on the shores of Lake Ladoga. It was like cutting the last blood vessel that carried blood to the city's heart. The railway collapsed, and with it, the last supply route. In that instant, 3 million souls were trapped inside Leningrad. There was no escape. The silence that followed was terrifying. The Germans did not advance into the city. That was never the order. They entrenched themselves around it, set up their artillery batteries, and readied the Luftwaffe guns. The plan was simple. Let the city devour itself from within. No German soldier needed to risk his life in urban combat. Starvation would be the perfect weapon. For the residents, reality hit like a hammer blow. Bakeries closed, trains stopped, and markets emptied within hours. Desperate families rushed to stock up on what little remained: a sack of potatoes, a loaf of stale bread, a liter of cooking oil. But nothing would be enough. From above, bombers swooped down on food and water depots, destroying vital supplies. Flames and smoke engulfed neighborhoods. The smell of burning mixed with growing fear. People began to understand they were doomed. The siege wasn't just military, it was psychological. The German soldiers knew this. From the outside, they watched the city wither away. Inside, millions of men, women, and children watched the gates close behind them. The gigantic Soviet metropolis was transforming before their eyes into a deadly prison. And that would only be the beginning of hell. Every battle, every hero, every story, all here. Subscribe and be part of this living memory. As the siege closed in, the sky over Leningrad became a constant nightmare. The roar of Luftwaffe engines echoed day and night, a warning of death from above. Bombers dove in precise formations, raining fire and steel on factories, hospitals, food depots, and even schools full of children. The once lively streets became corridors of smoke and debris. Industrial neighborhoods went up in flames, spewing black columns that blotted out the sun. Entire houses were reduced to rubble in seconds, and worst of all, the targets weren't just military. The Germans knew what they were doing. They were aiming for the city's civilian heart. The sound of shrapnel left no room for silence. Windows shattered like icicles, walls cracked, and bodies were thrown to the floor by the force of the explosions. Entire families rushed down to the basements, huddling in the darkness, praying the next bomb wouldn't fall on them. And as the planes moved away, the heavy artillery came into action. Long-range cannons fired relentlessly, hammering the city. The noise was deafening, each impact shaking the earth like an earthquake. No one slept. No one had peace. The hell was constant, and it seemed to have no end. Among the targets destroyed was one of the most precious, the city's vast food stores. In a single attack, thousands of tons of grain were incinerated, burning along with them the last hope of stockpiling provisions for the approaching winter. When residents saw the reserves in flames, many understood that the Germans' true weapon wasn't the bomb. It was hunger. Still, the city wouldn't surrender. Men and women, even wounded and starving, rushed to put out fires, save neighbors. Trapped in the rubble and rebuild destroyed factories. The enemy wanted to break the spirit of Leningrad, but on every corner, on every devastated street, a flame of resistance arose, but no one could deny it. The price was beginning to be paid. The first signs of famine were already appearing, and winter, the cruelest of all, was just arriving. If you feel the thrill of history, click subscribe and relive the moments that changed the world. The winter of 1941 fell upon Leningrad like a death and sentence. Temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. The wind cut through the skin like blades, and bodies already weakened by the bombings now faced an even more relentless enemy: hunger. Food supplies had disappeared. Bakeries distributed a dark, bitter bread made from flour mixed with sawdust, straw scraps, and even wood dust. Each person received only 125 grams per day, a tiny piece, smaller than a closed fist. Was it enough to keep someone alive? No, it was only enough to prolong the suffering. In the streets, crowds shuffled like shadows, gaunt with sunken eyes and pale faces. Children fainted in bread lines, desperate mothers carried skeletal children, malnourished soldiers could barely lift their rifles. The city of millions was beginning to transform into an open-air graveyard. The cold made everything worse. Running water froze, heating was out of fuel, and electricity was cut off in many neighborhoods. People gathered around makeshift fires inside their apartments, burning furniture, books, and even family portraits to try to survive the night. But at dawn, the heavy silence betrayed death. The rigid bodies of neighbors and relatives lay on the stairs, on street benches, and inside their own homes. And as the people agonized, the sirens continued to wail. Bombs fell on the starving, turning bread lines into mounds of corpses. The terror was unrelenting. Every day, thousands succumbed. What Hitler wanted was happening. Hunger not only killed, but also broke. Morale. Still, the city didn't raise a white flag. Even weak, even starving, Leningrad resisted, but no one could deny it. Winter would be a worse executioner than all the German cannons combined. Witness courage, suffering, and victory like never before. Subscribe and join this epic journey. With the blockade tightened and food supplies burning to ashes, life in Leningrad became an act of desperation. What was once considered trash was now treasure. People boiled wood glue into a thick soup. They tore leather strips from belts and shoes, cooking them as if they were meat. Even rats, cats, and dogs were hunted through the streets, disappearing one by one from the city's corners. The children cried helplessly, asking for bread that didn't exist. Mothers tried to trick them, putting pots of water on the stove to boil as if they were preparing food. They hoped sleep would come before hunger. The cold was another tormentor. Without coal or firewood, families burned doors, furniture, even entire libraries. Precious books, works of art, everything fueled the small flames that barely managed to ward off the icy death. Inside the apartments, breath froze in the air, and the walls dripped with ice. Bodies piled up in the streets. No one had the strength to bury them. Makeshift carts circulated, collecting corpses, stacking them like firewood. Sometimes children dragged their dead parents. Other times parents carried children stiff as stone. And amidst this horror, the city still tried to survive. Factories, even without power, continued to produce ammunition. Workers fainted over the machines but were replaced by others who could barely stand. The radio broadcast patriotic songs and speeches of resistance, trying to keep the flame alive. It was hell in every sense: hunger, cold, death, destruction. And yet, the city's spirit was unbroken. The Germans believed Leningrad would fall within weeks, but in the face of this unimaginable suffering, something impossible happened. The starving city still resisted. What would you do in the heart of the battlefield? Find out. Click subscribe. The Siege of Leningrad, which lasted nearly 900 days, from September 8, 1941 to January 27, 1944, was not only a military confrontation of epic proportions, but an existential ordeal that tested the limits of human endurance in a way few events in history have. The city, birthplace of the Russian Revolution and an unshakable symbol of Soviet pride, was relentlessly surrounded by Nazi forces who, under the direct orders of Adolf Hitler, sought not only its capture but also its total annihilation through a deliberate strategy of starvation, cold, and relentless bombardment. Leningrad became a laboratory of human suffering, where food shortages, the brutality of the Russian winter, and the constant threat of death combined to create a landscape of unprecedented desolation, pushing its inhabitants to a moral and physical breaking point, culminating in unimaginable acts of desperation and, at the same time, in an extraordinary display of resilience, solidarity, and an indomitable will to survive. Leningrad's strategic importance to the Third Reich was multifaceted. Its fall would have meant a devastating blow to Soviet morale. the release of large contingents of German troops for other fronts, and control over the Baltic fleet and the region's industries. However, the city's resistance thwarted these plans, transforming the siege into a symbol of Soviet stubbornness and the failure of the German blitzkrieg, forcing the enemy to divert resources and troops that would have been crucial in other campaigns. Hitler's decision to besiege Leningrad rather than attempt an outright capture, based on the belief that the city would succumb to hunger and cold, proved to be a colossal strategic error, underestimating the Soviet people's resilience. Stories of sacrifice that will touch your heart. Subscribe and feel every moment cannibalism and despair. The darkest shadow of hunger and human degradation. The famine in Leningrad was not a theoretical abstraction. It was a tangible reality, a voracious parasite that clung to every cell of the body, slowly draining life and transforming existence into a daily, exhausting struggle for survival. Daily rations, initially already insufficient to sustain life, were progressively reduced to a mere 125 grams of bread for workers and 60 grams for dependents. A bread that was, in reality, a heterogeneous mixture of sawdust, cellulose, bran, and other substitutes with very little nutritional value and a bitter taste that would become synonymous with despair. The bodies of Leningraders, once robust and full of life, were transformed into walking skeletons, skin stretched taut over prominent bones, eyes sunken and dull, reflecting chronic exhaustion, hopelessness, and the constant presence of death. Muscle atrophy was widespread, and edema, a result of a severe lack of protein and vitamins, swelled the limbs and face, creating a false and grotesque impression of heaviness, while the skin became translucent and cold to the touch. Energy for any activity, even the most basic ones like walking, talking, or even thinking clearly, was an unattainable luxury. The city streets, once vibrant and full of life, became silent, dotted with frozen bodies lying where they fell, many of them victims of extreme cold, starvation, and disease, awaiting removal by teams barely strong enough to carry out their task, often succumbing to exhaustion and death themselves. Daily life was reduced to a relentless pursuit of calories, where every scrap was a treasure and each day lived a victory against annihilation. The mind, as affected as the body, was haunted by hallucinations of food, vivid dreams of feasts, and a constant obsession with anything edible, driving many to madness or a state of profound apathy. Weight loss was drastic and rapid, with many losing up to a third of their body weight in a few weeks, and immunity plummeted to dangerous levels, making the population extremely vulnerable to diseases such as scurvy, dysentery, and typhus, which spread rapidly amid poor sanitation and hygiene. The winter of 1941-1942 was particularly brutal, with temperatures reaching 40 degrees C, freezing water and sewage pipes, forcing residents to melt snow for drinking and live in unsanitary conditions, further increasing the spread of disease and mortality. The lack of electricity and heating turned apartments into icy tombs, where families huddled together to share residual heat, burning furniture, books, and anything that could generate a flame to ward off the biting cold. The lack of basic services, such as public transportation and garbage collection, transformed the city into a dystopian landscape, where survival was the only rule. The bodies of the dead often couldn't be buried immediately due to the frozen ground, and were piled up in makeshift mass graves or courtyards, constant reminder of the scale of the tragedy. Children in particular suffered immensely, with many orphans wandering the streets and the infant mortality rate reaching alarming levels. Secrets of World War II no one ever told are here. Subscribe and see history from a new perspective. In this scenario of extreme degradation, morality and ethics, fundamental pillars of civilized society, began to disintegrate under the overwhelming weight of biological necessity. Rumors of cannibalism, initially whispered with horror and disbelief, quickly materialized into a shocking and disturbing reality, spreading like a moral disease throughout the city. The pressing need to survive overcame all social, religious, and moral prohibitions, pushing some individuals beyond the limits of humanity. The bodies of the dead, once mourned and buried with dignity and respect, became, for a desperate minority, the last and most terrifying source of calories. Cannibalism in Leningrad manifested itself in two main forms: necrocannibalism, which involved the consumption of already deceased corpses, often found on the streets, in hospitals, or in makeshift cemeteries, and, in rarer and more disturbing cases, murder for consumption, a transgression that terrified everyone and was punished with the utmost severity. Shocking accounts describe the clandestine sale of human flesh on the black market, disguised as horse, pork, or other animal meat, a macabre trade that thrived in the darkness of despair and hopelessness, where human life had little value in the face of overwhelming hunger and the absence of any other options. Trust between neighbors and even family members was eroded, and the fear of being a victim or witnessing such acts hung like a dark cloud over the city, transforming every interaction into a potential risk. The mere possession of a loaf of bread could be grounds for murder, and the law of the fittest, or the most desperate, often prevailed, leading to an atmosphere of paranoia and widespread distrust. Society itself fragmented into survival units, where solidarity was a luxury and self-protection a brutal necessity. Dehumanization was a gradual but relentless process, where hunger and cold corroded not only the body but also the soul, leading to acts that in normal times would be unthinkable. The Soviet police, despite their efforts, faced a nearly impossible task of controlling the situation, and the population lived under constant threat not only from the external enemy, but also from internal degradation. What really happened behind enemy lines? Click subscribe and uncover every detail. Soviet authorities, though struggling to maintain order amid widespread chaos and social disintegration, recognized the gravity of the situation and the danger cannibalism posed to the city's social cohesion and morale. The cannibalism section of the Leningrad police was established with the specific mission of combating this practice. Its files, now declassified, reveal a series of horrifying and heartbreaking cases that paint a grim picture of the human condition under extreme duress. Mothers who, in a final act of love distorted by hunger and desperation, killed their youngest children to feed their older ones, in the vain hope that at least some would survive the ordeal. Neighbors who mysteriously disappeared, their absence soon understood as a terrible fate and a grim warning to those who remained, and individuals who, pushed to the absolute limit of existence, committed unthinkable acts to prolong their own lives for another day or even a few hours. The military tribunals acted with relentless brutality, imposing the death penalty by firing squad on the cannibals, not simply as an individual punishment, but as a desperate attempt to stem the moral disintegration of society and reaffirm human values amidst collapse. The existence of these trials, however, served as a grim and undeniable testament to the depths of the abyss into which the city had fallen, a constant reminder of the human capacity for cruelty and despair when faced with imminent annihilation. The memory of these acts remained like a deep scar on the psyches of the survivors, a reminder of the fragility of civility in the face of extreme hunger and the need to never again allow such horror to be repeated. The long-term psychological impact was devastating, with many survivors suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, and profound guilt for having survived, while others were not so fortunate. Many developed a lifelong aversion to food, while others became obsessed with it, hoarding supplies and living in constant fear of scarcity. The experience of the siege shaped generations, leaving indelible marks on the city's culture and collective memory, and influencing Soviet literature, art, and music for decades. They fought, suffered, and survived. Don't forget these voices. Subscribe and keep their memory alive. However, it is crucial to note that even in the face of such horror and the overwhelming temptation of starvation, the vast majority of Leningraders refused to give in to cannibalism. Human dignity, even under the most extreme pressures and deprivations, prevailed for many. Preferring death to total dehumanization became a silent yet powerful act of resistance, an affirmation of humanity itself in the face of barbarity. This choice, made by thousands of individuals, underscored the unbreakable strength of the human spirit and the intrinsic belief in morality and civilizing values, even when life itself was at stake. The resilience of the people of Leningrad manifested itself not only in military resistance, but also in maintaining a spark of humanity amidst the darkness, in sharing meager rations, in mutual aid, in organizing makeshift hospitals, in maintaining networks of solidarity, and in preserving culture and art, even under inhumane conditions. Orchestras, like the Leningrad Philharmonic, continued to play in freezing concert halls with hungry and exhausted musicians, and the premiere of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, known as the Leningrad Symphony, in August 1942, was an act of cultural defiance and a symbol of the city's unwavering resistance, broadcast by radio to inspire not only Leningraders, but the entire Soviet Union and the world. Museums protected their collections, libraries maintained their archives, and poets wrote verses that inspired hope and resilience, proving that the human spirit could transcend physical misery and that culture was a powerful weapon against barbarism. The city, despite being besieged, continued to live, resist, and create, a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the unshakable belief in ultimate victory. Cultural life, though precarious, served as a psychological refuge and a way to reaffirm identity and civility amidst the chaos, a reminder that beauty and art could flourish even in the most adverse conditions. The determination to maintain cultural life was a way to deny victory to the enemy, to prove that Leningrad would not be just a pile of ruins, but a bastion of civilization. Lake Ladoga and the road of life, the frozen artery of hope and the triumph of the will. When Leningrad was on the brink of total collapse, its food and fuel reserves exhausted, and its population decimated by hunger, cold, and disease, an icy miracle emerged to offer a ray of hope and a chance for survival. Lake Ladoga, this vast body of water, the largest lake in Europe, which in summer was an insurmountable natural barrier to supplies due to its size, the presence of enemy forces, and the lack of suitable vessels, transformed in winter into an ice bridge, the only vital link between the besieged city and the rest of the Soviet Union. Known as the Road of Life, Doroga Zhizny, this precarious but essential route became the artery that pumped life into Leningrad's dying heart, a symbol of Soviet determination not to abandon its hero city and its ability to innovate under extreme pressure. The construction and maintenance of this ice road was an unprecedented feat of engineering and logistics, requiring the tireless labor of thousands of engineers, soldiers, and civilians who labored in inhumane conditions, under constant threat of enemy attack and the ice itself. The route, stretching some 30 kilometers across the ice, was equipped with checkpoints, warming points, and even makeshift field hospitals, demonstrating the scale of the effort. Maintenance crews worked 24/7 to repair cracks, avoid dangerous areas, and ensure the road remained passable even under constant bombardment. With every meter built, every ton transported, Leningrad's hope grew stronger. The road of life was not just a road, but a battlefield in itself, where human ingenuity and resilience clashed with the brutality of nature and war. In the depths of winter, when temperatures plummeted to tens of degrees, below zero, reaching 30 degrees C, 40 degrees C, and even 50 degrees C, The ice on Ladoga reached a thickness sufficient to support the weight of heavy vehicles. Soviet trucks, many of them old, ill-suited for the extreme conditions and poorly maintained, risked crossing the frozen surface. Each journey was an odyssey against death, a race against time and against the forces of nature and the enemy. The drivers, mostly young, inexperienced and exhausted, faced not only the biting cold, visibility limited by blizzards and the polar darkness, but also the constant danger of the ice giving way. Treacherous cracks opened under their wheels, and many vehicles, with their precious cargo of food, fuel and ammunition, sank into the lake's icy waters, taking their occupants with them. The frozen tire tracks, the wreckage of submerged trucks, and the makeshift crosses of ice and wood became somber landmarks along the route, silent testaments to the sacrifices made and the lives lost in the name of Leningrad's survival. Each day, hundreds of trucks made the crossing, carrying not only supplies, but also the hope that the city would not be forgotten and that help was on the way, a constant reminder that Leningrad was not alone in its struggle. The route was constantly patrolled by soldiers and engineers who monitored the ice thickness, marked dangerous areas, and carried out emergency repairs, ensuring the continued flow of supplies even under the most adverse conditions. The determination to keep the road open was absolute, as the lives of millions depended on it. With each successful journey, the city's morale was renewed, and the belief in ultimate victory strengthened. The road of life became a symbol of resilience and a feat of engineering that defied the laws of nature and war, a triumph of human will over adversity. Despite unimaginable dangers and constant losses, the road of life was Leningrad's salvation. Through this fragile but uninterrupted route came the essential: supplies that kept the city breathing and fighting, sacks of flour for bread, the only source of calories for many, cans of meat and other canned foods, coal and firewood to heat the hospitals, schools, and the few remaining homes, and, crucially, weapons, ammunition, and military reinforcements for the city's defense. In the opposite direction, the road served as the main evacuation route. Thousands of children, women, the elderly, and the wounded were evacuated from the frozen hell of Leningrad, transported by trucks and trains to the relative safety of the Soviet countryside, far from bombings, hunger, and disease. It is estimated that over 1 million people were evacuated via this route during the siege, an unprecedented logistical and humanitarian feat in the history of warfare, which saved countless lives and allowed the city to continue resisting, even if by a thread. The organization and discipline required to keep this route running under such conditions was a testament to the Soviet capacity for mobilization in times of crisis, and to the dedication of every individual involved, from the drivers to the dock workers and engineers. The road of life was not just a transportation route, but a symbol of resilience and hope, a vital link connecting the besieged city to the rest of the country, and a constant reminder of the human capacity to adapt and overcome. However, the road of life was not a sanctuary of peace, but a front line in constant combat. The German Luftwaffe, aware of its strategic importance to Leningrad's survival, relentlessly bombed the convoys, transforming the ice into an open-air battlefield. Air raids transformed the ice into an inferno of explosions, with bombs falling, machine gun fire ripping through the air, and enemy and Soviet planes crashing. The ice, already weakened by the weather and constant traffic, cracked even further under the impact of the explosions, increasing the risk of sinking. The courage and determination of the drivers, the soldiers protecting the route, the engineers working tirelessly to keep the road passable, and the civilians helping with loading and unloading were tested every minute. They worked exhausting shifts, repairing the ice, avoiding dangerous areas, facing the enemy and nature, keeping alive the flame of resistance and hope against all odds. With each bombing raid, with each truck lost, the determination to keep the road open only grew, a testament to the unwavering will to win. Soviet air defenses, though limited, did their best to protect the convoys, and Soviet fighter planes fought fierce aerial battles over the frozen lake, adding another layer of heroism and sacrifice to the story of the Road of Life. The losses were enormous, but the route was never completely cut off, ensuring a minimal flow of life into the city. And with each obstacle overcome, the legend of the Road of Life grew, becoming a symbol of perseverance and sacrifice for future generations. Sisib, outcome and the legacy, the victory of resilience and the price of survival. The Siege of Leningrad was finally broken on January 27, 1944, after 872 days of incalculable suffering. The Leningrad-Novgorod offensive, launched by the Red Army, succeeded in driving German forces from the city's vicinity, ending the blockade. The liberation was greeted with a mixture of exhausting relief and profound sadness over the losses. More than 1 million Leningraders, mostly civilians, died during the siege, mainly from hunger, cold, and disease. The city lay in ruins, its historic buildings damaged, its infrastructure destroyed, and its population decimated. Yet Leningrad remained undefeated, a symbol of Soviet resilience and the human capacity to endure the unbearable. The city received the honorary title of Hero City in 1965, a recognition of its extraordinary courage and sacrifice, and a monument to its unwavering resilience. The victory at Leningrad was not merely a military one, but a victory of human will over barbarism, a testament to the indomitable spirit of a people who refused to be broken. The legacy of the Siege of Leningrad is multifaceted and complex. It is a story of horror and despair, of human degradation and impossible choices, where the line between survival and barbarism became blurred. But it is also a story of heroism, solidarity, resilience, and the unbreakable will to survive, to maintain human dignity, even in the most adverse circumstances. The lessons learned in Leningrad resonate to this day, serving as a grim reminder of the costs of war, the cruelty of hunger as a weapon, and the importance of protecting human dignity under all circumstances. The Road of Life remains a monument to ingenuity and courage, a thread of hope that stretched across the ice and saved an entire city. The memory of those who died and those who survived in Leningrad continues to inspire and warn, ensuring that the sacrifice and resilience of its inhabitants are never forgotten, and that the story of their struggle serves as a beacon for future generations of the human capacity to persevere in the face of the most extreme adversity and the importance of defending humanity against all forms of oppression. The Siege of Leningrad is a dark but essential chapter in human history, an eternal reminder of the human capacity for cruelty and, paradoxically, for greatness. It is a narrative that forces us to confront the depths of human despair and, at the same time, celebrate the extraordinary resilience and unwavering strength of the human spirit. The reconstruction of the city, a monumental effort that involved the entire Soviet Union, was a testament to the determination to erase the scars of war and restore Leningrad to its former glory, transforming it into a symbol of rebirth and hope. The Siege of Leningrad, one of the longest and most brutal siege operations in history, unfolded not only within the confines of the besieged city, but also in its outskirts, where the Red Army waged a desperate and bloody struggle to break the Iron Ring, strangling the metropolis. While the civilian population of Leningrad endured hunger, cold, and silent death, Soviet forces abroad, under immense pressure from Moscow and Joseph Stalin himself, launched repeated and often fruitless offensives against the Wehrmacht's fortified positions. These operations were often characterized by poor planning, chronic resource shortages, inadequate weaponry, and poor coordination between units, resulting in an exorbitant human cost and minimal or no territorial gains. The fighting around and the failed Soviet offensives, a sea of blood and sacrifice. The German strategy of Siege of Leningrad was relentless and effective. The Wehrmacht's defensive lines, meticulously constructed and fortified with bunkers, trenches, minefields and barbed wire, formed a nearly impenetrable barrier. The well-equipped and iron-disciplined German soldiers were entrenched in elevated positions, enjoying a significant tactical advantage over the swampy and forested terrain surrounding the city. Against this fortress, the Soviet command, driven by a political and moral need to relieve Leningrad, ordered massive frontal assaults. Entire divisions, composed of exhausted soldiers, many of them newly recruited and with little combat experience, were launched in waves against the German defenses. The landscape around Leningrad, already inhospitable, transformed into a hell. Of mud during the thaw and deep snow in the winter, hampering the movement of troops and vehicles and making logistical support a nightmare. Soviet soldiers, often wading through waist-deep snow, became easy targets for strategically positioned German machine guns, which reaped lives in continuous bursts. Precise and devastating, German artillery turned every clearing, every attempted advance, into a slaughterhouse, pulverizing Soviet formations and leaving behind piles of frozen and mutilated bodies. These offensives, though tactically disastrous, were a brutal demonstration of the Soviet doctrine of persistence and sacrifice. With each failure, with each massacre, more soldiers were thrown into the fire in a desperate attempt to find a weak spot in the German line. The Germans, for their part, watched with a mixture of contempt and bewilderment the apparent Soviet indifference to the loss of life. They mocked the attempts, calling them useless sacrifices, unable to comprehend the depth of Soviet resolve and the symbolic value Leningrad represented for the regime and the people. Many of these battles, though bloody and with thousands of casualties, are barely recorded in the annals of military history, overshadowed by the magnitude of the siege and the scale of the war in the East. They were short, brutal offensives that invariably ended with the Soviet retreat and the consolidation of German positions, leaving a trail of devastation and death across the frozen tundra. Yet behind the apparent futility of these attacks lay a crucial psychological dimension. Each offensive, however failed and bloody, kept hope alive within Leningrad. Civilians, cut off from the outside world but aware of the struggle raging around them, knew that out there, their compatriots were fighting, dying to liberate them. This certainty, even built on rivers of blood and sacrifice, was what still kept many resisting, what gave them the strength to endure another day of hunger and cold. It was proof that they had not been forgotten, that help was on the way even if at a terrible cost. The city was trapped in an iron noose, and the Soviets did not yet have the decisive force to break it. But constant pressure, even if ineffective in breaking the siege, prevented the Germans from transferring troops and resources to other fronts, keeping them fixed in Leningrad and contributing to the general wear and tear of the Wehrmacht in the East. Time, with each passing month, began to turn against Hitler's army, which found itself increasingly bogged down in a war of attrition for which it was unprepared. Winter as Soviet ally, the unexpected general. The Russian winter, a relentless and legendary force of nature, became one of the Soviet Union's most powerful yet cruel allies during World War II and during the Siege of Leningrad. It manifested itself as both a merciless executioner and an unexpected savior. Within the besieged city, the cold killed mercilessly. Temperatures plummeted to tens of degrees below zero, transforming Leningrad into a frigid and deadly landscape. People froze in the streets, their rigid bodies transformed into ice statues, silent witnesses to the brutality of the siege. The unheated houses, with shattered windows and walls cracked by the bombings, were silent tombs, where entire families huddled under torn blankets, trying in vain to cheat death. The lack of fuel meant that even the few remaining wood-burning stoves were useless, and the search for any combustible material, furniture, books, pieces of wood, became a daily obsession, a desperate fight against hypothermia that claimed lives as quickly as starvation. But on the other side of the lines, the Russian winter also took its devastating toll on the invaders. Adolf Hitler, obsessed with the idea of a quick and decisive victory in the Soviet Union, the infamous Blitzkrieg, had not prepared his troops to face the icy hell of the north. The Wehrmacht, accustomed to swift and victorious campaigns in Western Europe, was woefully unprepared for Russia's extreme weather conditions. Light uniforms, boots that couldn't withstand ice and snow, and equipment that didn't work in sub-zero temperatures turned the German advance into a white nightmare. Engine oil froze in tanks, rendering them inoperable. Guns jammed in the extreme cold, turning rifles and machine guns into useless lumps of metal. Trucks broke down in the frozen tundra, leaving entire convoys paralyzed and vulnerable. German soldiers, lacking proper equipment and winter combat experience, lost fingers, toes, and even their lives to cold-related gangrene, hypothermia, and respiratory diseases. What should have been a lightning victory turned into a war of attrition, where the most implacable enemy was not the Red Army, but the climate itself. For the Red Army, winter, though brutal for its own troops, offered a crucial advantage. Soviet soldiers, accustomed to the harsh climate and equipped with more suitable winter uniforms, had learned to survive and fight in the snow and ice. Their morale, though shaken by losses and the harshness of war, still held strong, driven by the defense of their homeland. The Germans, by contrast, found themselves increasingly trapped in a hostile land, where there was no shelter, no warmth, no mercy. The snow that suffocated the civilians in Leningrad also suffocated the invaders, burying their dreams of conquest under layers of ice and despair. It was as if Russia itself had risen against them, transforming the weather into a lethal weapon, an insurmountable barrier protecting its cities and its people. Ice, wind, and snow joined forces with the Red Army in the besieged city, wearing down the German forces, sapping their morale and depleting their resources. Leningrad lay in ruins, but the frozen hope held firm. If they held out long enough, perhaps winter would defeat the Germans before they defeated the city. The belief that General Winter was fighting alongside the Soviets became a powerful element in propaganda and troop morale, a reminder that nature was on the side of the motherland, and that victory, though distant, was inevitable. With each day of bitter cold, with each blizzard, with each frozen German tank, the balance of the war tipped imperceptibly in favor of the defenders of Leningrad and the Soviet Union as a whole. Living in besieged Leningrad wasn't simply an existence, it was a daily, relentless struggle against death, a constant battle where every breath, every heartbeat was a precarious victory against the combined forces of hunger, cold, and despair. The city, once a vibrant center of culture and industry, was transformed into a nightmare scenario where human life was reduced to its most elemental form. The relentless pursuit of calories and warmth, the struggle for bread, the symbol of survival and degradation. Bread, a staple and universal food, became the most precious of treasures in Leningrad, a symbol of life and death. When it existed, it was a grotesque shadow of its former self, a dark, sticky mass made from a heterogeneous mixture of rye flour, sawdust, cellulose, ground paper, bran, and in some accounts, even brick dust. Its taste was bitter, its texture gritty, and its nutritional value minimal. A tiny slice, often no bigger than a matchstick, was all a person could eat in a whole day, a ration that barely scratched the surface of the hunger that gnawed at their bodies. Entire families, with children and the elderly, shared these crumbs as if they were rare jewels. Each piece counted, each bite savored with desperate intensity. Hunger was a constant pain, an excruciating emptiness in the stomach that never went away, making food the sole obsession, the sole thought dominating the mind. The lines to receive this piece of bread were scenes of indescribable horror, a microcosm of the city's suffering. Hundreds of people, walking ghosts of themselves, huddled in the snow, coughing with lungs corroded by hunger and cold, shivering uncontrollably, fainting from weakness and exhaustion. Many died right there, falling frozen to the ground, their rigid bodies transformed into ice statues, without the strength even to breathe their last. Sometimes bodies remained in line for hours, mistaken for the living, leaning against each other until someone realized they were no longer breathing, that life had silently ebbed away. Removing these bodies was a macabre task, carried out by teams barely strong enough to carry the dead, many of them succumbing to the same fate. The dignity of death was an unattainable luxury, and life a heavy burden. The desperate search for water and heat, elemental challenges. Water, another essential element for life, was a constant torment. With pipes frozen and the city's infrastructure collapsing, the only source of drinking water was the Neva River. People, mostly women and children, walked for miles, through snow and ice, dragging empty buckets and containers. Reaching the river, breaking the thick ice with improvised axes or pieces of wood, they filled their buckets with icy water that weighed more than they did, and began the arduous journey back. Many did not return. The biting cold, extreme weakness, incessant shelling, or enemy snipers killed them. Water, once at home, had to be melted and boiled, a process that consumed the limited energy and scarce fuel resources. The lack of basic sanitation turned the city into a hotbed of disease, with epidemics of typhus, dysentery, and scurvy spreading rapidly, claiming lives already weakened by hunger. The cold was as lethal an enemy as hunger. Leningrad's already notoriously harsh winter became a frozen hell without heating. Temperatures plummeted to below zero, and apartments without electricity and with shattered windows became icy tombs. Families huddled in a single room, sharing their residual body heat, burning furniture, books, clothes, and anything that could generate a flame to ward off the biting cold. Smoke and soot filled the air, causing respiratory problems, but the warmth, however fleeting, was a matter of life and death. The search for fuel was as desperate as the search for food, and trees in the city's parks and gardens were cut down to fuel the makeshift bonfires, leaving the urban landscape even more desolate. Degradation and resilience, the human soul under extreme pressure. Amid this struggle for survival, the line between humanity and barbarism blurred. The city's animals quickly disappeared. Dogs, cats, pigeons, and even rats all became food, a desperate source of protein for the starving. Those who couldn't find anything else resorted to unthinkable substances: wall glue, boiled leather, toothpaste, and even soup made from sawdust. The obsession with food led to acts of desperation, and morality in many cases gave way to the primal need to survive. And silently, and even darker, terror loomed: cannibalism. Stories of missing people circulated the streets, and neighbors distrusted one another. Fear and paranoia eroding social bonds. The hell of hunger had corroded not only bodies, but the very human soul, driving some to commit acts that, in normal times, would be unthinkable and repugnant. Yet even in the abyss of this horror, human resilience manifested itself in small but powerful gestures of dignity and solidarity. A mother who saved her share of bread for her son, even if it meant her own death. Neighbors who shared scarce water or a piece of firewood. Doctors and nurses who continued to care for the sick and wounded, even when hungry and exhausted. Teachers who tried to keep schools running, offering a glimpse of normalcy to children. Artists who still painted or wrote on yellowed scraps of paper, keeping alive the flame of culture and hope. It was as if, by insisting on remaining human, on maintaining civility and dignity, they were directly challenging Hitler, denying him his moral victory over the city. The resilience of the Leningrad people manifested itself not only in military resistance, but also in maintaining a spark of humanity amidst the darkness, in sharing meager rations, in mutual support, in organizing makeshift hospitals, in maintaining networks of solidarity, and in preserving culture and art, even under inhumane conditions. Each day survived, each scrap of bread fought for, each step taken in the frozen snow was a silent victory against the siege, a testament to the unbreakable will to live and the strength of the human spirit. Daily life, though brutal, was a continuous act of resistance, an affirmation of life against annihilation. The memory of these acts of quiet heroism and the extraordinary resilience of Leningrad civilians remains a lasting legacy, a reminder of the human capacity to endure the unbearable and to find hope even in the darkest circumstances. In the midst of so much cold, hunger, and death, it seemed impossible that anything human could flourish. But in Leningrad, culture became a weapon of resistance. The city that was on the verge of becoming a cemetery still dared to sing, play, and create. The most striking story came from Dmitri Shostakovich, the great Soviet composer. During the siege, he wrote the Seventh Symphony, known as the Leningrad Symphony. It was a gigantic work, full of fury and pain, that captured the spirit of a city that refused to die. In 1942, the symphony was performed inside Leningrad. The theater was in ruins. The musicians barely had the strength to hold their instruments. Many had already died of starvation. Those who remained were gathered together, some taken directly from the front lines. They rehearsed fainting, playing with trembling hands, and then on a day marked by history, the music echoed. The loudspeakers spread the symphony throughout the city, and even to the German lines on the other side of the siege. The Nazis, surprised, heard the somber and triumphant melody piercing the silence of war. It was as if the city itself was screaming, "We're still alive! You won't break us!" It wasn't just music. It was a psychological act of war, a declaration that, even starving, even freezing, the citizens of Leningrad still had a soul, still had a voice. At that moment, the violins and drums became more powerful than cannons. It was a reminder to the world, and to Leningraders themselves, that the city, though brought to its knees, still resisted. The price of resistance in Leningrad was almost unimaginable. Of the approximately 3 million inhabitants who lived in the city before the siege, more than 1 million perished, most not by bullets or bombs, but by hunger, cold, and disease. The streets were littered with corpses. Bodies piled on makeshift carts were taken to mass graves, where they were buried without a coffin, without a name, without a farewell. Many were simply abandoned in the snow, turning the avenues and squares into open-air cemeteries. Entire families were wiped off the map, buildings where all the residents died of starvation. Orphaned children wandered alone, searching for food among the rubble, often collapsing helplessly in the middle of the street. The city's infrastructure was destroyed. Heating was virtually non-existent, drinking water was minimal, and hospitals struggled to save lives without medicine, anesthesia, or electricity. Surgeries were performed by candlelight, with rusty instruments. And then there was the constant bombing. The Luftwaffe turned entire neighborhoods into smoking ruins. Shops, schools, libraries, churches, nothing was spared. It was as if the Nazis wanted not just to kill the people, but to erase the very soul of Leningrad. The suffering was so great that it remains difficult to measure even today. Some accounts tell of neighbors who, upon meeting, would ask, not, "How are you?" but rather, "Who in your family is still alive?" It was normality within hell. The city resisted, but was forever marked by this sea of blood and destruction. Every brick, every street, bore the memory of those who fell. Leningrad's fate seemed sealed, but the war, like winter, was changing direction. In late 1942 and early 1943, as the Germans lay bleeding at Stalingrad, the Red Army began to gain strength. New, better trained and better equipped divisions were sent north with a clear mission: break the Siege of Leningrad. In January 1943, the Soviets launched the Operation Iskra, the Spark. After months of secret preparations, heavy artillery opened fire on the German lines. The ground shook, trenches were pulverized, and columns of infantry advanced under enemy fire. The fighting was brutal. The Germans resisted fiercely, turning each position into a fortress covered in machine guns and mines. But this time, the Soviets had learned from their previous mistakes. They used tanks, artillery coordination, and combined attacks. After bloody fighting, they managed to open a 10-kilometer narrow corridors south of Lake Ladoga. It wasn't the end of the siege, but it was enough for the city to begin receiving supplies more securely. Trucks, improvised rails, and even boats reinforced the road of life. For the residents of Leningrad, it was like breathing after nearly drowning. The hunger hadn't ended, the cold hadn't gone away, the bombings continued. But now there was a glimmer of hope. The siege still existed, but the Nazi wall was beginning to crack, and time, once again, was ticking in the Soviets' favor. With the Eastern Front in flames after Hitler's defeat at Stalingrad, each day Leningrad held out was a step closer to victory. The city was not free yet, but for the first time in 2 years, there was light on the frozen horizon. January 1944. After 872 days of suffering, the city of Leningrad finally breathed a sigh of relief. The Red Army launched a colossal offensive against the German forces. Artillery, tanks, aviation, everything they had was thrown against the enemy lines. The sound of the cannons echoed relentlessly for days, shaking the earth and cracking the ice. The Germans, already worn down by years of war and pressed on multiple fronts, were unable to resist. Their positions crumbled before the Soviet fury. As the last Nazi soldiers were driven from the outskirts, the city, still in ruins, heard the announcement. The siege of Leningrad was finally broken. Joy exploded across the frozen streets. Families embraced in tears. Ragged survivors raised red flags. Bells rang even in destroyed churches. It was the end of a nightmare that had lasted nearly 2.5 years. But victory had an incalculable price. More than 1 million dead between civilians and soldiers. Every street was a silent memorial, every square an invisible cemetery. The city had won, but it was forever marked by suffering. Leningrad's legacy was not just military, it was human. The entire world was shocked by the resilience of that starving, frozen and bombed-out city, which refused to fall to Hitler. Leningrad proved that even under the most inhumane conditions, the will to survive can be stronger than any army. To this day, the memory of the siege remains a symbol of resistance and sacrifice. A painful yet proud reminder that a people can face hell and still emerge with their heads held high. The legacy of Leningrad. When the cannons finally fell silent and the snow began to melt, the city that had been transformed into a vast field of death and ruins began to show signs of life again. Leningrad was no longer the same. Entire neighborhoods had disappeared, historic buildings reduced to rubble, factories destroyed, streets pockmarked with craters and the skeletons of military vehicles. But despite the physical and emotional devastation, the city endured, and its people, even exhausted and scarred by loss, displayed a strength that defied comprehension. Families tried to rebuild their lives from scratch, orphaned. Children were sheltered in makeshift shelters, and neighbors shared what was left to survive. Factories slowly resumed operations, and workers, many still weakened by hunger and cold, resumed producing weapons, tools, and supplies, as if defying fate to let Leningrad disappear. The spirit of resistance that kept the city alive during 872 days of siege became the stuff of legend. Every story of heroism, every act of solidarity, from cooking food with minimal resources to protecting the most vulnerable, was recorded in memoirs, diaries, and accounts that would become lessons for future generations. Monuments and memorials arose in the following years to remember those who perished and to honor those who resisted, transforming the tragedy into a lesson in courage, perseverance, and dignity. Leningrad thus became an eternal symbol that humanity, even in the face of absolute terror, can rise from the ashes and transform suffering into memory, despair into determination, and destruction into hope. The city showed the world that resilience can be more powerful than any army, and that the courage of a people can withstand even the cruelest winter.